Always fun doing the technical piece of this. All right, I think I've got it. Great. Well, thank you everyone for having me here today. I'm really excited to be able to share some work that we've been doing with the Packard Foundation that evaluates our foundation's joint sustainable seafood strategies. So today, oops, let me see, I'm flipping the wrong slides, just one moment. Oops, there we go. So today I'd like to describe the report and then share some of the findings with you. And then finally discuss application of some of these findings to Latin America. And I am so honored to be able to follow Lucas's presentation. I've seen his work many times, and it inspires us and has been very informative in our process of completing this evaluation. So our evaluation, both foundations have a commitment to rigorous evaluation of our strategies and to really make sure that we're making progress and course correcting along the way. Through this evaluation, we identified some new gaps and challenges that we can use to then figure out how we best support both our grantees and our industry partners in their work on the ground. We tasked the evaluation team with two objectives. The first is to document the progress of the sustainable seafood movement over the last 20 years. And the next is to identify gaps to help us inform where we can take our work in the future. And as the foundations review their strategy in the coming year, this evaluation is going to provide critical information to helping us figure out what our new strategies and new areas of engagement look like. There we go. The evaluation assessed the past 5 years of our foundation's joint strategies and focused on the key components of our joint grant making. And this includes buyer commitments, pre-competitive collaborations, certifications and ratings, fishery improvement projects, and social responsibility. And then with this, and as Lucas shared with us, the framework for market transformation was a critical piece of understanding our progress and the work that we were doing. This framework was really important for helping us understand both how change happens in our markets and where the foundations can help move us towards a sustainable seafood industry. But it also helped us recognize that the path for the sustainable industry is actually very common to the path that many other sectors take. And while we recognize that every market is at a different place along this journey, and the needs of every market at the moment are different, there's a lot that we can learn from one another as we continue this work. There we go. So what did we learn? I think first off, the evaluation found that the diligent work of our grantee partners and through the diligent work of our grantee partners and our industry partners, the foundation strategies are delivering progress. Efforts to produce seafood responsibly have engaged a critical mass of companies in the US and Canada, where over 90% of the retailers have commitments to sustainable seafood, and also in the Northern European retail market, where over 85% of the European retail market has commitments to sustainable seafood. And these commitments are helping to incentivize better fishing and fishery practices, as well as fisheries policies globally. We also evaluated the progress of a number of tools that we employ. And these tools, double clicks there, sorry. These tools also show that we're having impact on the water. The volume of seafood that's engaged in certification and fishery improvement projects are rated by Seafood Watch continues to grow. And today, more than 35% of global seafood production is certified. And then industry uptake of these tools has also increased over time as we see more and more fishery improvement projects being listed on fisheryprogress.org, which you will be hearing about during this session as well as other tools that we are developing with our partners in the industry. But I think it's really important to reflect on the comments that Lucas made that more projects does not necessarily get us to where we need to be. And the evaluation reinforced this by identifying additional areas where we need to have impact, recognizing that there are still several barriers to achieving our sustainability goal. While the evaluation suggests that we are making headway on many of these issues, we'll have to significantly we'll have to change how we work and work together and try new things if we want to move beyond that 35% of certified, rated, and improving fish to our targets of 70 to 75% of global production. The first recommendation where we have an opportunity to refine our strategies for impact is to move beyond sustainability commitments. We know that these are now fairly common in a lot of the major markets. In markets where they're not common, like Latin America, there is an opportunity to increase the number of commitments. However, we found that the commitments vary greatly, especially in terms of NGO alignment on social responsibility and transparency. And that makes accounting for progress very difficult. And this means it's challenging to draw a line from a company's individual sourcing commitment to the impacts that we're looking for on the water. And it's important to remember that our success is not judged on having a clean supply chain. Our success is judged on whether or not we're producing healthy fisheries for both people and the planet. The second opportunity for impact is that the evaluation found that fishers and other supply chain actors who are closer to the water tend to bear most of the costs of transitioning to sustainability. These may not be from direct investments, but certainly some of the regulations that need to go in place have some short-term financial challenges for fishing communities that we need to help them move past. And it's essential to use our market leverage to help ensure that these seafood supply chains are more equitable and take immediate steps to address and remediate labor abuse, which is the most egregious of those social impacts. And finally, our evaluation very clearly pointed out that retailers and seafood companies alone cannot do this. The market is essential as a partner in driving for change, but governance and governments are still critically important to driving success on the water and achieve success at scale. And that, again, very much reflects the findings that Lucas shared with you from all of his research in multiple sectors. So what does this mean for Latin America? Well, we did not focus on Latin America as a market in the evaluation. However, there was a recognition that what worked for the US and European market can't just be plopped down for the rest of the world. The findings identified 5 key areas of focus where we would need to build on in order to develop market demand in emerging sustainability markets in Latin America and Asia. The first is enforcement. Again, enforcement is a key tool for making sure that the sector is following the rules. And whether this is compliance with catch limits or combating illegal fishing, these are cornerstones of building a sustainable supply of fish and ensuring that the rules that we have in place are actually being applied and followed. The next is local capacity. We believe that having organizations closer to the water who can engage on the sustainability of their own fisheries is more effective than having international organizations working on the ground for a little bit and then leaving and going back to their home countries. We believe it's critically important to ensure that local industry, local NGOs, and local fishing communities are empowered to manage the sustainability of their own fisheries. The next issue is transparency, because sustainability isn't something that you can see by looking at a product. Having transparency and traceability are critical if we're going to make claims about sustainability. Information about how a product was produced, how the fishers were treated in that process needs to be put in the hands of the people who can define sustainability, whether that's a certification, the government, or an internal purchasing policy. But without that information and a standard to compare it against, there's no way to know if something is sustainable. And trust me, isn't the same as transparency. Government capacity is also critically important. As Lucas pointed out, supply chains don't manage fisheries. And if the governments who are tasked with managing these shared resources don't have the capacity or the ability to manage their fisheries effectively, it's unlikely that we're going to achieve our goals of having sustainable fishing. So it's really important that we work together to help build that capacity and incentivize the government to manage their fisheries, again, both for the long-term financial well-being of their communities, but also the health of the environment, because the two are intricately linked. And finally, market infrastructure is critical to understanding what the industry and the supply chain looks like. It's very difficult to make progress on sustainability if we don't know who the middlemen are, if there's no transparency. And if we don't know who the end buyers are, that signal that there's demand for sustainable seafood can't be communicated to fishers. And so we recognize the importance of all of these things, some of which are well defined in the US and European markets that are farther down this path, but some are still not. So it is work that we can all do together. So this seems like a lot to do, and I will admit, in fact, that it is a lot that we need to change. And we do have models that we can build on. Again, thinking to Lucas's transformation of the market, these paths are repeated over and over again. And so learning from one another is a very important part of getting to those goals. We know that when major buyers demand sustainable seafood, the supply chain responds so they can source sustainable seafood. And this in turn creates a business opportunity for suppliers who are willing to source sustainable seafood, and where there's more information about the supply chain and stronger relationships between buyers and suppliers, we can help increase transparency in the system. Suppliers can then act in their own best interest and purchase sustainable seafood to sell to these buyers and invest in fisheries improvement. And all of this means that producers have the incentive to change in order to keep or secure access to these suppliers. Now, this was the theory of change that we had operated on in the US and Europe for a long time. And what the evaluation pointed out and what Lucas's findings indicate is that we were missing a major piece of this puzzle, and that is the role of government. And by building these champions and these supporters who have an invested interest in the long-term sustainability of seafood and fisheries, we've built a collection of advocates who can work with their local governments to help make sure that fisheries are well managed and to take on that role of that the supply chain can't, and that we need to ultimately scale our impacts to our goals of having broadly, globally sustainable fisheries. So we also have evidence that this works on the water. Our evaluation really looked at the Latin American sector or region as a seafood producer rather than a market. So the data I have here comes from the production side. But as a producer, and many of you in this room and many fisheries throughout Latin America are responding to demand for sustainable seafood. In the past 5 years, we've seen rapid growth in the number of fisheries in this region entering fishery improvement projects or earning certification. And these three donuts, as we've been calling them, reflect the amount of fisheries, the amount of wild fishery production that's either certified, green rated, yellow rated in an improvement project or red rated. And before we get concerned about red rated fisheries, I will say that these ratings are still really important to know where we need to improve and how we can do better and move those fisheries on a sustainable path. But these three countries, Mexico, Peru, and Chile, have been a focus of the Walton Family Foundation strategy for the last 5 years. And our partners on the ground, both in industry, NGOs, and government, have been instrumental in seeing these slices of the pie grow during that investment or during that period of investment. So we'll go back to the slide that Lucas presented, where we see that awareness of the project is the start, and eventually we try to move to a level playing field. So I just want to overlay this with some examples of where we've seen different pieces of this work happening in the US market, so you have a sense of what this might look like in your own market. The pattern that we saw was that early on, we saw fisheries collapsing, and we saw organizations starting to rally consumers around boycotts and boycotts of certain fisheries and other campaigns against consuming unsustainable seafood. Well, this is obviously very concerning both to the fishers as well as the companies who sell this fish. Boycotts do not help their business, and they certainly don't allow them to engage in a way that they need to help improve fisheries. So those boycotts eventually led to some forward-thinking retailers making commitments to source sustainable seafood and engage and try to fix fisheries rather than eliminating more and more product from their sourcing. And so we saw early in this work that a handful of retailers made commitments to sustainable seafood in the US. More recently, we've seen that sustainability commitments are now the norm, with the vast majority of retailers in the US and Canada making commitments to sustainable seafood. These commitments are important, but as Lucas pointed out, they're not going to get us to the scale we need. And so the big question that we have, not only for our work in the US and Europe and increasingly Japan, but globally, is how do we move to that level playing field? And that is actually something that we should all be figuring out together, because that's not a challenge that's limited to one market or the next. It does require different markets to work together, because the seafood supply chain is a global supply chain. So just to give you a quick snapshot of where we are and how we position different markets, I want to again recognize that every market is on its own journey. Northern Europe has been at this for a number of years, and they are really getting to that point of critical mass and institutionalization. They're increasingly thinking about the retailers on what they can do to level the playing field, and are relying on working together now for advocacy to reform fisheries. And you can see that through entities like the Global Tuna Alliance, which is primarily made of UK tuna importers and retailers, and also Kalamazoo, which operates in Peru, which is Spanish importers of squid, who are really working to change the policies and the management around squid, not just in one supply chain, but across the fishery. And then we see emerging sustainability practices happening in China. And we don't expect China and Germany to be in the same place. China is relatively new to having discussions about sustainability. But we also know that we can't meet our goals if China takes 20 years to get to the same place Northern Europe is. And so my hope is that markets in Latin America can learn from the markets farther down the path and use the tools and the momentum that comes from these interconnected supply chains to quickly move to widespread adoption of sustainability, so we can get to that level playing field together. If we don't, again, I'm concerned that we're not going to get to the scale we need to have healthy fish stocks and a flourishing seafood industry. I'd like to close with just some issues that the evaluation identified as being ones that were on the horizon. And I think these issues in particular are issues that point to the fact that a single supply chain, a single sourcing commitment cannot get us to where we need to be. These are big issues, and they're issues that the industry should have an active role in addressing together. The first is illegal fishing. The seafood industry has a critical role to play in eliminating IUU and labor abuses, not just in their own supply chains and not just from the products you source, but end those practices that harm people, the planet, and the reputation of the seafood industry. And this is going to require coming to some alignment around expectations on transparency and expectations that governments have appropriate rules, regulation, and capacity to actually address IUU fishing and human rights abuses. The next issue is climate change. And while this is not something that the seafood industry can control, we need to be prepared for the impact that it has on fisheries that supply the seafood industry. And again, the industry has a role in helping to advocate for climate-ready management in order to protect the fish that our sector depends on. And finally, the evaluation raised the issue of whether or not fishing communities are actually benefiting from sustainable sourcing. The sustainable seafood movement needs to better understand who is bearing the cost of transitioning these fisheries to sustainability and who gets the benefits. It's important to recognize that sustainability cannot be about a price premium in the end, not if we want it to scale. But we also need to recognize that those fishers who are closest to the water are the ones who are having to make a lot of the changes in their practices and therefore have an undue burden in helping to transition us to sustainability. But they also have a lot to gain. When their fisheries are sustainable, they spend less effort fishing, they have higher yields, and that helps them be more profitable as well. So sustainability is something that benefits them and the supply chain in the long run, but we have short-term needs that we need to figure out how to address. Once we know that, we can make sure that the costs and benefits are more equally shared across the supply chain. And without that, sustainability will never be durable, and again, will suffer from a decline in fish stocks. So as we close and as I take questions, I want to encourage all of you to view our full evaluation at oursharedseas.com. It's an extensive evaluation, but there are nice little snippets that you can pull out if there's an issue, whether it's a fishery improvement project or pre-competitive collaborations. that you can dig deeper into. And for those of you who are able to participate in that evaluation, I'm so appreciative of your time, and thank you so much for having me here.
Teresa, thank you very much for your talk. It's really inspiring, and so was Lucas. So there's a lot of things we have to talk about and think about, and we have a couple of questions here from the audience. I don't know if it's great that Lucas is still here. And I don't know which of you both can answer the questions. And one of it is, what is the role of the industry here? Even though you both mentioned it, but in Latin America, industry is about small scale fisheries too. And a lot of the social aspects sometimes are not so easy to achieve, because there's a really big difference between the small scale fisheries and the big industry that have really access to the certifications, even to the FIPS. So what's the role of the industry? And the other question, so you can, any of you answer, how can we move faster? Because it's really urgent.
Yeah, thank you. I'm really happy to share questions and answers with Lucas too, because I think he's got great experience from other sectors that we can bring in. But we, I think when we think about the role of the industry, there is, the industry has a lot of power and often the ear of governments. And I think there's a greater opportunity for the sector to use those relationships and that influence to become better advocates for the policy changes that we need to see, to make fisheries a priority and sustainability a priority, not just short-term employment numbers, but the long-term health of the coastal communities that only comes with good management. And the industry is going to be an important voice in advocating for that. The approach that we've always taken at the foundation is that we need to build our champions from the people who are closest to the water and closest to the resource. And as long as we can get fishers and the supply chain and retailers aligned that sustainability is going to be necessary for the long-term health of their industry and their businesses, we believe that we can then get them aligned to help advocate for those changes. Lucas, do you have anything that you want to add on that?
Yeah, thank you. And by the way, Teresa, I just want to say what a great presentation. I really enjoyed it and learned a lot. Thank you for that. And the question is an interesting one as well. And so not just answering the question from a fisherman point of view, but from a farmer point of view, or smallholder farmer in general, their job ultimately is to produce in a sustainable way. That's what they do. They need to make sure that the fish is caught in a sustainable way, and they need to get organized so that they can do it in an efficient way, in a sustainable way, but also make sure that the free riders in that industry, the ones that are not doing it, also get out of the sector. So get organized and continue producing in a sustainable way. The rest of the sector, we have a responsibility to make sure that the fishermen and the farmers are being paid for their work. Because as soon as we are lowering the price and continue to keep them in poverty and below living income standards, well, what do we expect? Of course, they will get as much out of it just to survive. And so if we expect them to do it in a sustainable way, it's fair enough that we make sure that they can actually have an income, have a livelihood out of it. And so that goes to the market. What is their role? Their role is to buy the sustainable fish and to reward the fishermen for doing so. Now, the one that is left is, what is the role of the governments? Now, that's where we have, I think, already discussed quite a bit. So if everybody does what they should be doing, we have way less problems in the sector. Yeah. So, but without the fishermen, the sector will not be there. Let's recognize that.
Yeah, and I think there's two really just things in there that I want to highlight. And the first is that we do believe that people also need to have access to affordable, sustainable fish. Just because you're lower income doesn't mean that you shouldn't be able to access the sustainable seafood. And I think one of the real beauties of when we look across the sort of universe of sustainable seafood. Some of our most common fish, affordable fish, like Alaskan pollock, for example, which is MSC certified, is available to people at a very low cost. So not everything needs to be like the super premium, sustainable ahi. There needs to be options for sustainable fish that meets different taste profiles as well as price points. And so it's part of that goes to why sustainability should not be considered a premium. It should reflect the value of the product and the value of the work that went into the product. But it's not about using sustainability to make more money. It's about using sustainability for the long-term security of your business. And I want to highlight again Lucas's point about free riders. And this is again why a sourcing policy is not going to be sufficient for the long term. It's critical to have sustainable sourcing policies in business, but there will always be a competitor who is not going to do that. And as long as they're still allowed to source unsustainable products, they will undercut the good actors every time. And this really is why sustainability should be a pre-competitive issue. And it requires policymakers to set the floor and then allow people to compete on all of the other things that the industry is so good at competing at: quality, value-added products. And that is what we should be competing at, not at the core things that keep our industry going, which is sustainability. Because without fish, there's no seafood industry.
Well, thank you very much to both. Do you want to close, Lucas or Teresa, with some, another final quote? It's really interesting. We have to, how can we move faster in Latin America? If you have any other comment or whatever, really inspiring all what you've said. It's great seeing you together talk about this.
I would like to have Teresa have the last words. So I am Dutch, and that means that I can be blunt and direct, and I apologize for that. I also want to say I am not an expert in the seafood sector. My skill set is not being a sector expert. My expertise is how do you change things. What I would like to call is a call to action and a call to leadership in this sector. There is so much fragmentation, so much competition, and thinking too small, if you will. I'm calling for leadership in the sector from the retail. So who are of the retailers really think we need to move beyond just doing the certification, but also get the governments on board and improve the fishery management systems? Where are those leaders? I'm looking for governments, obviously. Which of the standard organizations is willing not to just continue to say, you need to do more of my standard? We have done that for 20 years now, but what can we do together to move forward? And which of the NGOs are willing to do that? And that's why I really enjoyed the presentation, Teresa. If that leadership come together, there's a lot that we can do. And so that will be my call to action. Sorry for my Dutchness and my blondness. This sector needs to step up and take the future in their own hands.
Well, thank you, Lucas. I don't have an excuse for being Dutch. It just is how I am. So I will have a similar comment in that, I think it is time for industry to not think about my supply chain, but think about what the goals that we're trying to achieve are and how those goals, and understand how those goals are critical to the long-term health of your business. I think as long as we continue to see articles coming out around human rights abuses in the seafood industry, the entire industry, whether or not its product in your supply chain, is going to be tainted by that bad news. I think as long as we see stocks declining, the entire industry is at risk of not having enough product to meet their customers' needs and their own business needs. And those are not issues that can be solved by just sourcing sustainably. The sustainable sourcing is still important. That sourcing sends a really important signal to the governments and to the industry that this matters. There was just an article that came out recently that showed that Walmart had increased seafood sales as a result of marketing sustainability and marketing their own sourcing. And those claims that led to those increased sales would not have been credible without without the commitment that they've made on sourcing. They can't talk about it if they're not doing it. So sustainable sourcing is necessary, but insufficient to get us to where we need to be. And so the next step of that means working together to address these bigger fundamental issues that the success of our sector depend on.
Yeah, it's really challenging. Thank you. Lots.
Well, words of hope, Lali, is that we're seeing the industry start to do this. I mentioned the Global Tuna Alliance. I mentioned Kalamazoo. There's an emerging group of mahi exporters that are doing that work as well. We see organizations like CBOS, which has 10 of the 14 largest seafood companies involved. So there are models that we can follow. Come Pesca's work in Mexico as well is a really great example. So I encourage those of you on these calls who are part of the seafood industry to think differently about how you would work with your competitors to address some of these issues, because that's where the opportunity is. And there is hope, and we do see progress. It just requires a little bit of a shift in how we think about these issues.
Yeah,
if I may add to that, the retailers that we're talking to, they are not just selling seafood, they are selling all of these other products as well. And so when we talk about pre-competitive collaboration, different ways of different models, talking to governments, they know this. They know this because they recognize what's going on in palm oil or in soy or in all of the other sectors. And so it's interesting that we have to remind them almost like, you're doing it in other sectors, why are you not doing it in the seafood sector? And so it's coming. I think, again, what's happening in other sectors is can really be of the benefit for this sector as well. And retailers will recognize the same kind of strategies that can be applied in this sector.
The question you couldn't read, Lucas, that was made to you a while ago. It was about the governments, and it's two questions, more questions, if it's okay with the time. I'm sorry, I get so nervous. Is that the agriculture? Do you think it's time to benchmark agriculture certifications we have today in one single scheme? That's one. And the other,
I believe I answered that one, but I'm happy to answer that one again.
and the other instruments, how can they help without applying subsidies and this relation in cheap products and decent prices for the producers? Those come from the audience.
Let me take the first one, and then Teresa, I'll give you the hard one.